So I finally tested all of the cars in Daily Race C this week, and I was actually quite surprised about the differences between the cars. We all know we usually have one OP car. It's pretty much every week, every single week is the same situation. But this week they gave us 12 kind of, I'm gonna call them same cars, but these cars are definitely not the same. We always have that one OP car, and if you go to the leaderboards, you will be able to see that only a couple of cars are used. But I decided to test all 12 of these cars and really see what is the actual difference. So let's begin with the first car on the list, and that was the Toyota Supra. And I thought that this was actually gonna be a pretty decent car, and of course you can see the difference in the straight line speed straight from the start. Unfortunately, I just couldn't get close to this Mazda, and it was by the end of the straight that I realized that I will most likely not gonna have a great time in this straight. So without this push from the guy at the back, I just couldn't get any closer to Flash. So all around me, once again, we had the Mazdas, and you probably know what is the best car of the week. I guess we all know it. But I somehow made it into the P3 with this car, of course, with a little help of the two guys in front of me. So they were constantly pushing me, constantly giving me a little bit more speed on the straight, and I was somehow able to finish in P3. But this car was mostly mediocre, and it just wasn't great. And then we need to go into the Nissan Fairlady Z, which is, in my opinion, from the 10 minutes of qualifying that I've done before, it was quite a decent car. It had good handling, but unfortunately you can see, well, you can see the big problem in here, and that's the acceleration. And you can also tell the difference in, well, in the slipstream. So in the slipstream, which is strong, it was definitely a game changer of this one, and you can see I wasn't gaining on the guy in front. It was almost impossible to catch the leader, and you can see without the push I had no straight line speed. It was impossible. But then in the braking zone I can get most of it back. It has amazing cornering, so handling of this car is pretty good. It's actually one of the best cars that I tried, one of the best handling cars that I tried. But unfortunately, even with the slipstream, it just isn't enough. So it's lacking the straight line speed. Strong slipstream, I have to say, strong slipstream. The other cars were going 250, 260. It was almost impossible. It was just impossible to catch the guys in front. And somehow, with, I would say, with a little bit of luck, I finished in P2. But this car wasn't great. It had good cornering, but not exactly great straight line speed. And then it was time for the Honda NSX. I honestly thought that this car was going to perform, and I thought it would at least have some decent straight line speed, and it kind of did. But also with that straight line speed came a lot of understeer, and well, I could have followed the guys in front, but I think the only reason for that was, well, I had an LFA instead of a Mazda in front of me. Straight line speed wasn't great, and cornering abilities, well, you can see even Mazda was gaining on me in the corners. So it was almost impossible to, well, keep it up with the guys in front. I mean, it was a lot of understeer. Again, it was good straight line speed. It wasn't great, and as you can see, 250 in the slipstream is a little bit better than the Nissan, but still it had a serious disadvantage in the corners, and unfortunately I got kind of tangled up in between these guys, and unfortunately I just couldn't do anything. The car was just missing a lot of straight line speed, and unfortunately in the corners it just wasn't great enough to even keep up with the Mazda that was a much quicker car in the straight line. So overall, this car was a huge disappointment for me, and unfortunately I just couldn't get the most out of this car and finished this one in P4. But I also think it could have been a lot worse without the help from some of these guys at the back, because with a push you can get a lot of speed on the straight. And then it came, well, this was actually a huge surprise for me, the Corvette C7. And while I was testing this car, I was actually able to get to a 57.0, or I think it was a 57.1. So the car in 10 minutes, you know, proved to be a decent one. So it can brake a lot later than all of the other cars, but unfortunately I think this was due to the lack of the top speed, and straight from the start you can see the deficit. It's almost impossible. And when I say almost impossible, you can clearly see the difference at this point. Not that I cannot get close to the guy in front, even with strong slipstream. It's 7 tenths. Almost came up to 8 tenths at that point. So 8 tenths after turn 1 with strong slipstream. So without the help of my Italian friend at the back, it would just be game over straight from the start, and it would be impossible. When I say impossible, I really mean impossible to get closer. It's just no way that I can do it. Cornering, on the other hand, was excellent. So acceleration was, in my opinion, not great. It was actually pretty terrible, one of the worst cars that I tried. But this car had amazing handling, and somehow I was able to keep up with P1 and somehow finish this one in P2. I think this was also kind of a lucky race, but with the slipstream I could potentially kind of stay with the P1 and maybe attack, but unfortunately with the lack of top speed that was almost impossible. And then it came, the Porsche 911 GT3. I thought this car was going to be a good one, but I was seriously disappointed. We're not even gonna be talking about the straight line speed. It was mediocre at best. It had great acceleration. I do have to say it's great acceleration, but unfortunately it's followed with a tremendous amount of understeer. So I cannot even explain the amount of understeer this car has. So I'm not sure if anyone picks this car, if it's even going to be close into maybe a second and a half to the guys at the top. So I'm just going to say that this car is almost impossible to drive. So with the lack of top speed, good acceleration, but unfortunately you can clearly see what's going on in here. I cannot keep up. I can definitely not keep up on the straight, and even cornering, and here you have to be extremely careful not to hit the curb in the wrong way, because the car is unstable in the middle of the corner, and then on the way out of the corner you just have so much understeer that it's almost impossible to control the car. So I really tried to give some space to the guy on the left, and somehow it had a little bit better acceleration than the Mazda, and I also think that he made a little mistake on the way out, but I don't know what to say about this car. I lost a couple of positions, no straight line speed, a tremendous amount of understeer, and in my opinion just a huge disappointment, and I would say by far the worst car that I've tried, by far. And now the usual, or the popular choice of many, and it was at the beginning of the week. I think also this car was dominating the leaderboards at the beginning of the week. So this car was kind of a popular choice. I do believe that this car has the potential, and it is the car that many of the guys actually use still against the Mazda, which we all know it's the OP car. And this car actually has good acceleration, decent straight line speed, and I would say pretty good handling. The handling of this car is better than the Mazda, and in my opinion it can actually win races. So this car is a pretty decent one. You can see here I'm in P9, but this wasn't my best race, and it was just at the beginning of the week. I didn't put in a good qualifying lap, and purely lap times and the overall performance at the end of the race isn't something that I'm taking into account. So I'm taking the ability to actually race against the other guys and actually to get something out of a race with the top speed, with handling, and if you can, for example, overtake, if you can accelerate, or if you can get some kind of advantage over the other car. So the lap time purely isn't a decisive factor when I say the LFA is a good car. So it's a good car, but it's good all-around car. So you can actually follow someone like Laporte. Of course, it's the straight line speed difference, it's also the strong slipstream, a lot of things I'm putting into account when I'm making this. So it's not purely the straight line speed, it's not purely the cornering. This car is just a good all-around car, and you can see you can actually overtake Mazda on the straight with a little help from my friend at the back. So it was a good experience with this car, and I think this car is definitely usable and maybe one of the best cars to use. I think it can actually perform a lot better than this P11 that I've done in this race, and it's definitely the car that can win races. It definitely is. And now we kind of came into the middle of this whole list, and this is the Jaguar. Unfortunately, I do not have a lot of positive things to say about this car. It's just a decent car. It's not great, it's not bad, it's mediocre mostly, and you can clearly see that from the start. You need good acceleration if you're about to keep up with the other guys at the front. I think on a different layout, on a different track, this car can be used, but unfortunately it just had a little bit too much understeer with not enough top speed to actually keep up with the Mazdas and to keep up with the pack. So you can clearly see straight from the start I had to defend, and I had to, well, I tried to make my race live, but it was really difficult, and this car was also very low and it was quite sketchy over the curbs, especially here in the bus stop. So curbs and this car are definitely not a good combination. Definitely not a good combination, and in my opinion, it's, for most of the people actually out there, it's a very difficult car to drive, and unfortunately I did not have a great time with this one. So it was mediocre, it was okay, but unfortunately this is not the car that I would suggest to anyone that is not A or A+ rated. This car is difficult to control, and unfortunately it's just not a great car. I actually had good expectations. But now the SLR McLaren. This is, well, this was kind of an interesting race, and I think I was really lucky in this race. But this car had decent acceleration. I'm not gonna say it's the best, it's not the worst, it's something in between. It's kind of 5 out of 10, and I had to kind of stay or try to stay close with the pack with some late braking. But as you can see, the straight line speed once again isn't great. It's definitely not the same as with the Mazda, and you can see all of the other guys are pulling away, and straight from the start I knew that this is gonna be a very difficult race for me. This car is drivable, don't get me wrong, it's actually quite stable, and maybe even too stable, so I think the suspension needs a bit of tuning, but it's a pretty decent car overall. So it's one of the cars that actually can drive, but still it's not the same as the LFA nor the RX Vision. So I really tried to make the most out of this car. It had good cornering, and somehow I made it to P1 with a couple of mistakes from the guys at the back. I took this very defensive line because I knew that this car was extremely stable, and I knew that it's just gonna go through the bus stop like it's not even there. So it's a very stable car, and somehow I think this decided this race, and I think this car deserves a little bit better grade than kind of the other cars that I've tested. Of course, I'm gonna reveal that later in the video. So this car, in my opinion, it's not exactly the same as the, let's say, the LFA or the RX Vision. It's mediocre, but it's a little bit step ahead, or it just goes one step ahead from the others at the back. So it's my first win, and then it was time to go with the Ferrari F40. Oh wow. Okay, I don't even know where to begin about this car, because it actually had decent cornering, decent straight line speed, decent acceleration, but unfortunately it just wasn't enough because the car is understeering a lot. So all of the other things, all of the positives that I said, it just goes away with the amount of understeer that this car has. So it's not as serious as with the Porsche 911. It definitely isn't. That car is like the worst, by far the worst, but unfortunately is just not good enough. So decent, as you can see, decent straight line speed. We're reaching 250 in the slipstream, of course, and I can brake late with this car. It is a stable car, but unfortunately it's just not good enough to stay up with the other cars. So it's, in my opinion, a mediocre option, and somehow at the end of this race I got myself into this nice battle. It was actually a pretty decent battle at this point. I know these guys were actually fighting quite a lot, and it was a pretty interesting fight. Unfortunately, Alvaro got a 1 second penalty, which meant that I would actually be promoted into P2. They both crashed into this corner, which was actually one of the most interesting races that I had in the entire day, and somehow I was in the lead, but I knew that my car is definitely not the car that is going to stay there. But I took a very defensive line once again. I knew that this car is going to go through the bus stop. I knew that I don't have to worry about the curbs, and I knew that somehow I can actually win this. So second gear, just trying to manage that understeer, and somehow I think I did a pretty good job until this point. And you can see I had a little touch, and unfortunately it all ended up like this. This is an extreme case of dirty driving, and this guy was pushing it all day. And here I'm not talking about the Frenchman, I'm actually talking about the Italian. So I think the Frenchman just wanted to say sorry and just wanted to leave me that space, but I watched the replay and I realized that it wasn't his fault in the end. But we're moving on to Diablo, and this car, well, I did not have great expectations about this one. I thought this car was going to be a decent one, but I never thought it was going to be one of those cars that can actually win a race or it can do anything around this track. And of course, I started up in P6, which is not the best starting position if you want to win this race or even finish on the podium. I know a lot of things can happen in this race, and somehow I was closer than I expected. I just wanted to let him know that I'm not going to go for that move. And I do have to say, it had pretty good straight line speed, especially in the slipstream. It was quite surprising for me, but unfortunately the cornering part wasn't great. It was, I'm not gonna say it unstable, because it's definitely not as unstable as some of the cars that I tried in here, but mediocre, and it's quite sketchy, especially when you go over the curbs. So combining this with the understeer, with a little bit of lack of, I'm just gonna call it handling, and in general the acceleration wasn't great. I wasn't able to extract the most out of this car. I just wasn't. Maybe someone else can do it, but unfortunately with a lot of understeer, of course, here dirty tires, and I just couldn't follow the other guys in the front, and there was no way that I can overtake. So I had to be extremely close, and that was pretty much about it. And then I got into this situation, which unfortunately for me ended up not in the best way. So I got on the outside, free wide into the bus stop. Isn't going to work. I actually had one more hit here, and yeah, that was pretty much game over. And unfortunately it just, in my opinion, just wasn't a great car. It was better than some of the other cars, but unfortunately it was just not the best, and I don't think you can even compete with some of the guys at the front. But now we came into a Ford GT. So this car was amazing. Just in those 10 minutes that I had with this car in the qualifying, and I almost improved my best time. I know my best time isn't much because I didn't spend too much time in the time trial, because I really wanted to have some decent races and, well, making it more interesting. But straight from the start I knew that this car was going to be a good car. It has amazing straight line speed, it was very stable, it had good cornering, and it's one of those cars that can, in my opinion, beat the LFA and beat the Mazda. So you can overtake with this car. It has decent cornering, as I said before, and it's a good all-round car. It's not exactly as great as the Mazda, but it's very, very close. Unfortunately, not exactly the straight line speed of the Mazda, but it's not, again, the same straight line speed as the LFA. It's kind of a little bit more, but in the corners you are actually losing a bit more time than you're losing with the LFA. So all in all, I think this car is a great car. Unfortunately for me, this race did not start great. I started in P6, as I said before, and it's just, you never know what can happen in this race. I really wanted to push it to maybe reach a podium, but unfortunately it just wasn't enough. So I think if I started in maybe P3 or maybe even P2, I could win this race. And for me, this was a success, because this race was much quicker than all of the other races that I just explained, or all of the other cars that I raced with, and I think this car definitely deserves a credit to be one of the best cars. But now, again, we are using a Mazda RX Vision, so I know you pretty much know what is the case with this car. It's amazing. It's just absolutely amazing. I don't even know what to say about it. We can just watch the straight line speed out of this car, and it's, in my opinion, it's incredible. The best car out there by far, and whoever gets this car in the World Series is going to have a serious advantage, while the other guys will be just hoping that, well, they can stick with the Mazda. So you can clearly see the difference in the straight line speed. We caught up with the leader. We kind of moved away from P4, which is the LFA, but somehow we got a little bit closer again, a little mistake, and now Manu and me, P1, P2, and it was like this for the rest of the race. And we can just watch the straight line speed with him being just about half a second in front. So you can clearly see it's just had straight line speed that it's better than with all of the other cars, and I was actually far behind. LFA, on the other hand, it's a huge surprise because it has good handling, it can catch up in the corners, and then if you don't have the slipstream, or if you're the only guy in front, then the LFA can actually overtake. But Mazda, in my opinion, the best one by far. So in some cases, in some situations, especially when we're going downhill, this car can slide, and it actually slides quite a lot. So you have to control it, and you have to be very careful on how you apply the power. But I don't even think I need to explain this car any further. It just has amazing speed, and it's just an amazing car overall. So in the end, this is what I found out. We all know that the RX Vision has the best straight line speed, and it's overall the best car. I mean, it's all over the leaderboards. We have a couple of cars that can actually be used, but I will actually go from the bottom. So the worst car, I will say by the worst car that I've tried, is the Porsche 911 GT3. It has decent acceleration, but unfortunately not enough speed, and well, I thought it was gonna compensate with the handling, but the handling is just the worst. So much understeer, and it's almost impossible to compete with any of the other cars around. The next stop, or the next car on the list, is the Honda NSX. Unfortunately, I really tried to get the most out of that car, but with almost no straight line speed, well, I'm gonna say it had a little bit more straight line speed, but it just couldn't compete against the RX Vision and all of the other cars around. Unfortunately, this car is a big no for me, and I'm not exactly sure how you need to drive this car to make it a lot better. I know it can go, I would say, a little bit quicker, but unfortunately, it just didn't cut it for me. And then we have a step forward, and unfortunately I was actually quite surprised with the Corvette and with the Nissan Fairlady. So this is something that kind of surprised me in the qualifying, but then when I thought about it, and when I thought about the whole process of grading these cars, I realized that I was actually quite fortunate in those races, and there is no way that I could make the same race again. It was almost impossible. These cars have absolutely no straight line speed. They have good cornering, but you simply cannot overtake in the turns. The only overtaking spot is on the straight. I mean, you can of course overtake if you go for a dive bump, but handling is good. It's actually great handling, but just not good enough straight line speed. And I think the Jag can be kind of put in the same category because it just wasn't great. It was mostly mediocre, and I thought about putting it into the next category or in the next tier, but unfortunately I couldn't. But in the next year, we actually have a couple of cars that were, well, they were usable. So for example, the SLR McLaren, this is the car that I actually won with. It was, well, I was actually quite lucky. I won with that car, but unfortunately, it's not the car that can compete with the Mazda. It simply isn't. It just lacks top speed. Cornering isn't great, but it's okay. And this is exactly why I put it, well, why I put it in this category. It's pretty much followed by the Diablo and the F40, which are the cars that lack a bit of top speed. They can have a kind of decent handling, but they're not the best. They're simply not the best, and unfortunately I just couldn't couldn't put them in the same category. And there is the Supra. Supra is... It's kind of in between. It doesn't exactly have the great handling, it does not have the great straight line speed. It's mostly mediocre, but it's one step, or it's a little bit better than the Corvette, and in my opinion just the top speed difference will put it into that higher category. And of course, in the next category we have the Lexus LFA and the Forge GT. So straight from the box, I knew this car was, or I knew that the Lexus was pretty good car, because at the start of the week everyone was using the LFA, and I actually seen a couple of guys use the Ford GT. Ford GT, great straight line speed, it can actually compete, and what can I say about the Lexus? It's a good all-around car, and it can, you know what, it can actually compete against the Mazda. And of course, as I explained it before, Mazda, it's OP. There is no question about it. This car has amazing straight line speed, it has good acceleration, good cornering, it has everything. And I think whoever gets this car in the World Series is going to have a serious advantage. So once again guys, please let me know what you think about this video, and let me know what you think about the tier list. So I probably need to make some readjustments, but I think this is it. So once again, thank you very much for watching the video, and until the next time, bye.